and welcome to the Sangamon Experience. My name is Ann Mosley. I'm the director and curator of the Sangamon Experience at the University of Illinois at Springfield. The program we are going to be offering you tonight is a series where we have been highlighting amazing women in local history here in the Sangamon Valley region, where we highlight women who have gone to great lengths to settle the Central Illinois region, as well as fight for social justices, care for their communities, and live just their average everyday lives. And as we celebrate Women's History Month here at UIS, we like to highlight the strong women who make up our population. Throughout the month, you've seen our Community Trailblazers program, where we have highlighted women who have been involved in their communities through working with schools, working with the nutrition of children, medicine, and next week we'll be covering women in activism. So this month we have covered quite a bit of local history, but there is always so much to learn and new experiences to check out. Tonight we will be hearing from Erika Holst, who is with the Illinois State Museum, and she is going to talk with us tonight about the early women of Sangamon County. Now, Erika is the Curator of History at the Illinois State Museum, as I stated earlier, and her most recent exhibition is currently on exhibit, which is Fashioning Illinois, 1820 to 1900. It's a collection of 19th century clothing worn by Illinois women. She has also worked in the public history field for more than 15 years, during which she has curated more than a dozen exhibitions. She is a passionate individual about her topics and the people that she researches. She tells the story of average everyday people throughout history through material culture and the stories that they have left behind. Before joining the Illinois State Museum, Erika served as the Curator of Collections at the historic Edwards Place in Springfield, Illinois. Now, she oversaw the completion of the renovation of the historic house as it looked in the 1850s. But Erika has not just been a curator, she's also an author. She has worked on different publications such as Wicked Springfield, Crime, Corruption, and Scandal during the Lincoln Era, Edwards Place, A Springfield Treasure, and one of my personal favorites, Historic Houses of Lincoln's, Illinois. She is a part of the Indentured program in early American culture, and she also does a lot of research on the maids and the aristocracy here in Springfield, Illinois. I can go on and on about the amazing works that Erika has been able to produce over the years and the amazing exhibits that she's been able to put together. But tonight, I'm going to have her tell the amazing story about historic women here in Sangamon County, the objects they left behind, and what is left to explore at the Illinois State Museum. So I'm going to bring Erika on and have her give her presentation.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Anne. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to talk about the women of early Sangamon County. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now since I have a presentation ready to go. Slideshow from beginning. Okay, so my topic tonight is called The Women of Sangamon County, A History in Objects. And the purpose of this talk is a couple different things. First, I'd like to introduce you to the biographies of some of the women of early Sangamon County. I'd like to get you thinking kind of broadly about the life experience of women and what they might have experienced coming to Sangamon County, whether they were wives or daughters or young women or indentured servants or enslaved women. The kind of common denominator for most of the Anglo-European settlers and enslaved women to this area is that most women Sangamon County wasn't their dream. They were mostly brought here at the behest of someone, whether it be a husband, a parent, even a master. So women kind of landed in Sangamon County and made the best of it and exercised their agency to create lives for themselves in a land that maybe wasn't their 100% first choice. So I want to dive into that. And the focus of this topic is a history in objects. So what I'd like to go through is kind of highlight these women's stories. They were selected by the objects that they left behind. So what do these objects say about these women, and what is the nature of the objects they left behind? Tell us broadly about what survives, whose stories are being told, and whose stories still need to be uplifted in museums. So I'm going to start with Indigenous women. The irony of the EuroAmerican women being brought to Sangamon County, sometimes maybe against their will or against their wishes, is that the true native inhabitants of the Sangamon country, and we're going to talk broadly about central Illinois now. The true native inhabitants were forced to leave. So the people who actually did call this land home were eventually withdrawn by the encroaching Anglo-European settlement. So Native peoples have inhabited the land that we call Sangamon County today for the past 12,000 years. People have migrated through the landscape, hunted and fished, and built villages and moved on. I'm going to focus today on the Kickapoo women of Sangamon country. The Kickapoo were the immediate past Indigenous people. They were the most recent Indigenous people to depart the county. They had arrived in the Illinois country in about the 17th century, and without going too deep into a long and complicated history, the arrival of Euro-American settlers, even on the Atlantic coast, caused a ripple effect within Indigenous communities that kind of moved people throughout the North American continent. And so the Illini people had previously occupied the land known as Sangamon country. They had sort of moved south, and the Kickapoo people, who had previously been eastern and in the Great Lakes area, sort of moved into this area. So Kickapoo women were part of a matrilocal society, which means that these women were the owners of houses. They were the controllers of resources within the tribe. When a young couple got married, they would live with the wife's mother's family until they built their own house, which would then be located next to the mother's family. And a Kickapoo woman's life was kind of geared around food production. Women were the main producers of food. Men were tasked with hunting and trapping, but women would cultivate crops on a seasonal basis and gather foodstuffs, and then also cook and produce and distribute the resources. So the Kickapoo were, again, greatly affected by the arrival of Euro-American settlers to the area. Initially, their first contact was with French colonists, and French and later to some degree British colonists. Their main interest in the Illinois country was in the fur trade. So the Kickapoo were active in the fur trade. Because the French placed such a priority on the fur trade, they were less interested in settlement and in the land. And so they had no desire to remove Native peoples from the land because they didn't want to upset the balance of the fur trade that was working for them, frankly. When the Illinois country passed to American territorial and then American statehood, Americans had a different view of the land as a resource, and they wanted the land for settlement. And this meant that the presence of Indigenous peoples became a problem for the American government. And initially, the American government adopted sort of a cynical plan of indigenous removal that involved gradually encroaching on indigenous lands. And the American way of thinking was that the closer we get to indigenous hunting lands, the less resources, the less hunting game will be available, and indigenous people will sort of just be forced to remove. And to some degree, this worked. Indigenous people definitely suffered from a decrease in their game and the encroaching of Euro-American settlers. And so Kickapoo peoples fought American settlement. They resisted. There were lots of skirmishes and guerrilla fights between American settlers and the Kickapoo people until finally during the War of 1812, William Henry Harrison concluded that a war of extirpation was necessary to remove the indigenous peoples from the area once and for all. So basically, during the War of 1812, the territorial governor, Ninian Edwards, marched along what was once known as an Indian Trail, now is known as Edwards Trace, and burned the Kickapoo village in what is now Logan County, and went up and burned the other village at Lake Peoria. The Kickapoo signed a peace treaty, but conceded nothing after this event, but sort of saw the writing on the wall and withdrew across the Mississippi River. 6 months after Illinois became a state in 1819, the indigenous people did move across the Mississippi River. There were a few people that stayed behind, but for the most part, the indigenous presence had moved west. And so Robert Pulliam is often considered the first Euro-American settler to kind of come to the Sangamon country, and it's no coincidence that he came in 1817, right as the Kickapoo were leaving, were being removed from that land. And so the object I want to share with you are a pair of Kickapoo earrings, and these were created probably by an American or Canadian silversmith. They were considered trade goods. They would have been traded with indigenous people for furs. And these were excavated at a Kickapoo village site in Logan County. It's now known as the Rhodes Archaeological Site. It was probably occupied in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It may very well be one of the sites that Ninian Edwards burned. And so these tiny, tiny earrings, I think, speak volumes because they speak to the influence of Euro-American settlement on the North American continent and how it made its way into indigenous cultural practices long before even the Euro-Americans and French settlers themselves showed up in person. The trade goods had become part of an indigenous way of life. They sort of heralded the beginning of the end. There was a set of events set in motion that ultimately culminated in the removal of the indigenous people from Illinois altogether and cession of all ancestral land. And the fact that these are archaeological artifacts that are excavated out of the ground, I think, are incredibly significant because it speaks to the fact that there's nothing in the museum that came to us by having been preserved and passed down through generations and then sought out by a curator to add to the collections. This was something that was left behind in the ground 200 years ago after a village was burned, so that it sort of powerfully speaks to the erasure of indigenous people in the American cultural landscape. So now we move on to EuroAmerican women, settlers of the Sangamon country. As I said, Sangamon County was not necessarily their dream, and there are some exceptions, and we'll cover some in the talk tonight, but for the most part, women are sort of along for the ride. They're coming with their parents, they're coming with their husbands. They usually have lives and social networks and kinship networks that are being left behind and are being taken into a land that is short on labor and will require a lot of their labor to make a go of it. And so women adjusted and made the best of it, and kind of had different destinies sort of based on their own inclination and also based on their roles in life, whether they were rural versus urban, whether they were enslaved or free, whether what their socioeconomic status was. So let's run through it and see who some of these women were and what their experiences were coming to Sangamon County. The first set of women I'm going to talk about are the daughters. And so these are the girls brought to Illinois as children by their immigrant parents, usually coming from an upland southern state or an eastern state. So these girls have, no agency because they're children, but they might arguably also have the easiest time assimilating because they are children, they are flexible. Life in Sangamon County is essentially all that they know. So the biggest challenge for these daughters is surviving childhood. 20% of children from the first half of the 19th century did not survive to see their 10th birthday. So surviving childhood was a big thing. If they survived, girls were brought up to help with housework, and this is regardless of their situation. They were taught cooking, mending, watching children. They're being trained to one day manage their own households. And again, in an area where labor is short, every hand was expected to pitch in. A girl might have a needle put in her hand by age 4 or 5 and be expected to help with the family mending as soon as she could kind of manage to sew her own things. Their experiences varied based on class and location. So a well-to-do urban girl might enjoy the benefits of an extended education. She might have some time to enjoy herself as a young unmarried woman. She might make a prosperous match and settle down in life and kind of enjoy a middle-class life of relative leisure for the 19th century, not leisurely compared to our modern standards by any means. A rural girl might expect an arguably harder life. A scarcity of women in early Sangamon County meant that a young woman could expect to marry early, and she could expect to bear a lot of children, and expect to do a lot of hard work on a farm or settlement. There are travelers who pass through the Sangamon County area in the 1830s and said something to the effect of, "It's rare to see a woman in the station who has reached the age of 30 without losing every trace of youth and beauty. You continually see women with infants on their knee that you feel sure are their grandchildren. Even the young girls look pale and thin and haggard." So the first set of objects I want to consider are this portrait and dress of Martha Enos, and they date to around 1832. Martha Enos was the daughter of a well-to-do family in Springfield. Her father, Pascal, was receiver of the land office. He was a speculator, an early landholder. You can kind of tell that they're of a kind of well-to-do situation by the fact that this child had a portrait painted in 1830s Springfield. Martha sadly died before she turned 13. She was 12 years old in 1837. And so this set of objects, I think, really speaks to the perils of childhood in early Sangamon County. Here was a young girl who had all the advantages, and that was not enough to save her life. The nature of an era where diseases run rampant, germ theory is unknown, vaccinations and antibiotics are unknown, just meant that it was a perilous time for children. Our next object to consider is a wedding dress, which belonged to Catherine Gears Yates, and she's from Jacksonville, so I'm sort of extending the boundaries of the Sangamon country a little bit to include Jacksonville for Catherine. And she was born in 1822 in Lexington, Kentucky. She was brought to Jacksonville at the age of 8 with her parents. Her father was a wealthy merchant, and he actually died when she was about 13 years old. And when she was 16, Catherine married a young lawyer named Richard Yates, who in 1860 would go on to become governor of Illinois. And so Catherine's dress, I think, speaks to the cultural impetus of women to get married, especially in a county where men outnumbered women 2-to-1. This was sort of the path that was charted out for women. They could mainly expect to get married. This is a time when the era of the companionate marriage is on the rise. So this is sort of a departure in thinking from earlier thoughts of marriage as sort of an economic contract. You know, like if the neighbor boy has a set of, his family's farmland adjoins your farmland. If you got married, then you would keep all that farmland in the family and make an economic alliance. That sort of thinking is giving way in the 19th century to this idea of romantic love and marriage as a partnership with an emotional bond and love between the husband and the wife. And so women are given a lot of agency in choosing a husband. Their families could sort of approve or disapprove, but ultimately it was felt that the decision rested with the woman. And so basically it's the most momentous decision that a woman could make in her life, because once she makes that decision, then she legally, in the eyes of the law, she is what's considered a femme covert. She legally, her husband is making her economic decisions for her. Her husband culturally is the head of the household, and his temperament and his inclination will have a huge effect on whether she has a happy life or not. And there are stories in Sangamon County of women who made a poor choice while marrying. There was a woman who married a man who was intemperate, and her husband spent her entire dowry, spent all the money that she had inherited from her parents, and left her with an infant. Mary Lincoln's first cousin, Elizabeth Todd Grimsley, married a man. Harry Grimsley was considered shiftless, and he eventually abandoned his wife and 2 children, and she was forced to divorce him and go back to her father's household. So a lot rode on the woman's choice of husband and on this wedding dress. So it's sort of this emblem of a woman at the apex of her agency and decision making, poised for the next phase of her life, hoping that it turns out well. And then finally in our category, oh no, I'm sorry, she's not our final daughter, she's our second to last daughter. The next one is a coverlet that was woven in the 1840s by Polly DeLay Torrence. She came to Illinois with her parents from Kentucky in 1829 at the age of 10. She married Samuel Torrence in 1841, and they settled on a farm near Rochester. And so this coverlet was woven by Polly. She also raised the sheep and the flax, carded the wool, spun the yarn, spun the flax, and wove this coverlet by hand. So I think that this coverlet sort of illustrates the labor associated, especially with farm women in the early 19th century. Raising sheep and weaving cloth is just on top of Polly's other duties of caring for livestock, caring for children, cooking, cleaning, sewing, mending, washing. So it's sort of, a lot of labor is expected on both hers and her husband's part, but wives, and we'll go into this a little bit later, are especially sort of bound to their homestead by the care of children and animals. So sort of a life of unceasing labor. And our final daughter is Phoebe Roundtree Floorville. Some sources have her given as born in 1811. Her grave marker, which is what we're looking at here, says that she was born in 1804, and I tend to go with the grave marker when there's a conflict like that, because you presume that the family would know, and if they're carving it into stone, then that's a solid date to go by. So Phoebe was born enslaved in Kentucky in 1804, and her enslaver also happened to be her father. And in 1826, she and her mother and her siblings were freed. And I'm sorry, I have the date there, freed by her father in 1815. That's incorrect. It's 1826. And so in 1829, she came with her father, mother, and siblings to Sangamon County and settled on a farm on Spring Creek, 4 miles west of Springfield. In 1832, she married a man named William Floorville, who was a Haitian-born barber and property owner. They had 5 children together. Floorville is someone you might have heard of by his nickname, Billy the Barber. But he was much more than a barber. He was a successful businessman in his own right. He owned, in the end, when he died, he passed on to Phoebe 15 business and rental properties in Springfield, as well as an 80-acre farm. And he was worth $2,000 in 1860, which put them at the sort of top of the economic ladder in Springfield. So Phoebe, the object that we have to commemorate her is her gravestone. And this, again, speaks to sort of a problematic nature in museums today. This is a, prosperous middle-class woman, and we don't have anything of hers. And this is sort of revealing of a collecting bias within museums that have historically tended to privilege white stories and white artifacts over those representing people of color. And so we don't have anything of Phoebe's to remember her by, nor do we know what her life was like as a prosperous middle class property owning woman in the mid 19th century. Her story has not been preserved to the extent that many white women's of Sangamon County is. So this is an opportunity going forward, I think, for museums and cultural institutions to reflect on whose stories are being told, whose objects are being preserved, and whose stories need to be told and uplifted. So we'll move on to single young women. Single young women, if you were a middle-class urban woman, this might be the category of women that had the most agency and the potential to have the most fun in Sangamon County. If you are an urban woman, there's a golden time in your life when you are around your teenage years, when your formal education is done, you haven't married yet, and so you are courting and out in society, and you don't have the responsibilities of your own household, and you also don't have the full responsibilities of your parents' household. And so probably the best example we can think of is a Mary Todd Lincoln. She represents women who are sent to Sangamon County to live with siblings or uncles, and they come for kind of complex reasons. They come to certainly help out their relatives in the household. They come to help care for kids. They come to meet a husband. Springfield is the young state capital as of the late 1830s. It's attracting a lot of ambitious men and professional men and men that are going places. And so if you're a single young woman, this is a place to go to meet a husband. There was talk of a New Year's Eve party at the American Hotel in 1842 that was attended by 300 to 400 men, 40 or 50 of whom, 40 or 50 ladies, and half of those were married and engaged. So what we see in the case of Mary Lincoln and a lot of these women are that they're being sent to a family's house in Springfield to kind of enjoy some society and catch a husband. And so the person that we're going to talk about is actually Mary Lincoln's sister, Frances. And this is because I don't have anything from Mary Lincoln's young single days in the State Museum collection. So part of what this talk is doing is sort of showing what objects survive, and it kind of gives a window into women and what survives, and we sort of have to extrapolate based on these objects. So Frances Todd Wallace was born in Lexington, Kentucky in 1815, and around 1836, she was sent to live with her older sister, Elizabeth Edwards, in Springfield. She was sent to get out of her stepmother's hair. She had a stepmother that she and her full siblings didn't really get along with. She probably came to help her sister with her growing family and with her hostess duties in Springfield, and again to meet a husband. So Frances was courted by men in Springfield. One of them was Abraham Lincoln, who took her out a couple times, but there were no sparks, so it didn't really go anywhere. She eventually married Dr. William Wallace. And the silver spoon is reflective. First of all, it sort of speaks to the entertaining nature of well-to-do women in Springfield. It's an object of refinement, and it's an object of entertaining. It was meant to be put out for company, to kind of put your best foot forward. It's also, you can sort of see it as the brass ring. Instead of the brass ring, it's the silver spoon. If a woman like Frances sent to Springfield is successful in a match and marries a prosperous man who can support her in style, then she will eventually have a silver spoon of her own with her very own name engraved in it to set her table and do her own entertaining and let the cycle begin again for her own daughters. So now we'll move on to talking about wives. Wives perhaps have less agency than young single women. They generally are being brought with their husbands, and every marriage is different, every person's situation is different. So certainly there were companionate couples who probably made a joint decision to, yes, let's start our lives in Springfield. But there were also women who had grown up in a locale somewhere in the South or the East that's 1,000 miles away from Springfield, and who are leaving behind their family and friends and the place they've known all their lives, and going to a place where they're going to live a relatively isolated life, cut off from social and emotional support, and being expected to shoulder a heavy domestic burden. And this domestic burden sort of is equal opportunity, whether you are an urban woman or a rural woman. An urban woman would move to a town where there's very scarce labor. So if she's someone who is used to having domestic help back in her hometown, she would not find it here. She would generally face sort of a lack of commercial availability of some of the goods and services that she might have been used to, and so would be thrown in the deep end learning things like making soap or making sausage, or things that she perhaps had not been raised to do. And an example of this is Helen Edwards, who lived at Edwards Place, the historic house I used to work at. He was raised in a boarding house in Connecticut by a single mother and brought to Springfield and kind of plopped down as a housewife and housekeeper in a sort of Western town, and had to learn the finer points of making sausage and churning butter. And she left a reminiscence of sitting at the churn and trying to churn butter, and it wouldn't come, and she cried, and her tears dripped into the butter, and she was afraid that her husband would remark on the extra saltiness of her tears in the butter. So the frustrations of trying to learn all these housekeeping tasks. If you're a rural woman, you were probably brought up to farm work and understand farm work, but there's an extra level of difficulty when it comes to starting a farm. It's not that these women came to Springfield or to Sangamon County and often they were starting a homestead, which is a whole different animal than coming to a farm where the fields are penned in and the ground is plowed and the land is cleared. There's a tremendous amount of labor just in getting a farm started, in busting the sod, in clearing trees, in building fences, in planting, and it's really an all hands on deck type of situation. In addition, as we mentioned before, there's an isolating aspect to farm life, especially for women. Men would go off to hunt and trap, and we're a little bit more less tied to the farm, shall we say. Women were basically in charge of a household, in charge of getting meals on the table, tending a fire, tending to children, tending to domestic animals. And so there are several accounts of women who, are desperately lonely because they just don't have a lot of social interaction on the farm. There was a man who was talking about settling in Illinois in the 1820s, and he said that Illinois is a heaven for men and horses, but a very different place for women and oxen. So some of the women I'd like you to meet, one was Salome Paddock Enos, and she came to Springfield in 1823 with her husband Pascal. They were one of the founding families of Springfield. They were a prosperous family, but she was widowed in 1832. She was left with 5 kids whose ages ranged from 10 days old to 16 years old. Her husband had a very complicated estate that required a lot of lawyers and lawsuits to untangle, and she had to manage her husband's assets and provide for her children on her own. And the objects we have from Salome are on the right are 2 baby garments that she sewed. These date to probably around the year 1830. And then on the left is her son's wedding shirt. When her son Zimri got married in 1846, Salome sewed the shirt for his wedding. And so these 2 garments, I think, speak to the labor of women and the obligations to her family that continue from infancy to young adulthood. Salome is tasked not only with supporting the family, not only with putting food on the table, both literally and figuratively, but keeping them clothed. It's the labor of her hands that's creating the garments for her family from the time they're infants to the time continuing on into her 20s, or his 20s, I should say. Widows are another category of women, and Salome is a good transition into that since she herself was widowed. She came to Springfield as a wife, though. Some women came as widows, like the woman we're going to talk about, but being widowed was a destabilizing event in a woman's life. A husband, traditionally in the 19th century, is the source of support, and a woman is a housekeeper, and her labor falls into the unpaid category. In fact, if you look at the letters written to petitioning people to be let out of prison, a lot of the letters talk about, we need this man to be released from prison because his wife and his children are starving at home. They need support at home. A lot of soldiers' letters from the Civil War express a lot of anxiety about how their wives and children are getting along at home without their support and without their labor. So a woman suddenly widowed had some options. It was probably an anxiety-producing time in her life. A lot of women remarried, and a lot of women that didn't remarry moved in with family members for support, with a brother or back to her parents' household. Some took in boarders or did sewing or did washing. Especially the sewing and washing, that was sort of considered a last resort because that was labor that was very intense and did not pay very well at all. The advantages to it being it was also labor that could be done within one's own home. If you're taking in sewing, if you're taking in laundry, you could do it in your own home and keep an eye on small children that needed minding. But it was a hard life for not very much money. And then there are women like Henrietta Ulrich, who we're going to consider here. And she actually took her widowhood and made the best of it. She had the advantage of financial help from some relatives, but she ended up becoming one of the wealthiest women in Springfield. So Henrietta was born in Russia, and as a young woman, she was an aristocrat who was a frequent guest at the court of Tsar Alexander I. In 1817, she and her husband moved to New York. He founded a woolen manufacturing business and became quite wealthy, and also then became ill and his fortunes declined. So when he died in 1841, Henrietta was left with 5 children and not a whole lot of financial support. And so she wound up moving to Springfield to be near a married daughter who had settled here, and she brought her 5 kids with her. And she had the advantage of a loan from a sister who is still living in Russia. So that sister loaned her some money. Henrietta invested in land and eventually became a land speculator and businesswoman in her own right. Her son, one of her sons when he grew, founded a lumber company that she was a partner of. And so at the time of her death, she was a very wealthy woman. She ranked up there with the wealthiest men in Springfield. And so the gloves that we're looking at are gloves that she brought with her from Russia. These were linen gloves that she had actually worn at the court of Tsar Alexander I. And so I think they sort of speak to this arc of Henrietta's life, that she started life as a Russian aristocrat, and then she became an immigrant to America, and she was a wealthy woman, and then she was a widow who had fallen on hard times, and then she was a emigrate to Illinois and a businesswoman. So she kind of came full circle and made herself the American version of an aristocrat again, but only after going through ups and downs and dramatic geographic changes in her life. Next, I'd like to consider domestic servants. Labor was scarce and dear in early Sangamon County, and so there were several families who chose to bring servants with them, either from their home states or there was actually an agency in St. Louis where you could go and contract with people and bring them to Springfield to work in your household. And then there's also the case of many local farm girls would do a stint as help in people's houses before they got married. Because labor was so scarce, the wages were excellent for domestic service. They're actually higher in the 1820s and 30s than they would be in the 1860s and 70s. One hotel keeper paid $2 a week for the help he had and said that if it were not for a desire of young girls for fine clothes, he would not get help on any terms. And so the nature of domestic service in early Springfield is kind of a blurred line. When you think of a domestic servant, we might think of like sort of a Downton Abbey, like wearing a black uniform with a starched white apron and mob cap. And that's really sort of a later manifestation of domestic service. In early Sangamon County, it was more of a case of household help. And so the kind of social and economic boundaries were a little bit more fluid. Servants weren't treated as second-class citizens necessarily. They were sort of treated as neighbors who came into your house to help. There wasn't an expectation that they would like serve you for life. Most young women were earning a little bit of money, sort of like a teenager having a mall job before she got married or moved on to a better gig or a household of her own. There's documentation of sort of conflicts between employers and domestic servants. There are employers who perhaps maybe feel like their domestic servants should adopt more of a subservient attitude. Helen Edwards, going back to her, had brought up a girl from St. Louis and was sort of shocked and scandalized that this girl expected to sit at the table with the family. But again, these women who are in domestic service are not thinking of themselves as second-class citizens or as a permanent servant class. They're thinking of themselves as taking advantage of an economic opportunity to earn some money by doing housework before moving on to something better. And we happen to have a great example of sort of this ambiguous nature of domestic service in the State Museum's collections. So you're looking at a photo of Nancy Dobbins, and we know that she arrived in Springfield in 1825. Her obituary said with the family of John Rowe, and then later that year, she found herself in the family of the Enos family. So Salome, who we were talking about earlier, this was their household helper. And Nancy actually lived with the Enos family for the rest of her life. When Salome died in 1877, she directed in her will that her daughter Susan, she wanted Susan to continue to give Nancy a place to live and support her. So she didn't leave Nancy any money, but she also directed in her will that Nancy would be supported. So Nancy's role in the family is sort of ambiguous and mysterious. Was she a servant? Was she a part of the family? Was she sort of both? And the two objects that we have here do little to shed light on that. In fact, they kind of only deepen the mystery. On the right is a silk shawl, and the family that donated the Enos possessions, God bless them, because they had written, someone in the 19th or early 20th century had pinned handwritten notes to all these things, saying who owned, who made them, who used them. So the silk shawl came with a note pinned to it that said that this was Nancy Dominson's shawl, and the fringe was made by Grandma Paddock. So Salome's mother made that fringe. So this is a very dressy and refined and sort of a luxury item. On the left is a cotton coverlet, and the note pinned to that said that the cotton in the spread was raised and carded and spun and woven into the spread by Aunt Nancy Dobbins. When it got too heavy for her to launder, she gave it to my sister Kate. And so presumably this is later in the 19th century. Kate is of the next generation. So Nancy Dobbins is both wearing silk shawls and she is laundering cotton spreads way into her old age. So again, the nature of her relationship to the family is sort of ambivalent. And then I should say as a caveat that the domestic servants I was talking about were free women being paid wages. Illinois was a land of enslavement and indentured servitude, and this doesn't seem like it should be the case because it was part of the Northwest Territory and it was ostensibly a free state. There was also, however, a loophole in Illinois' first constitution that said that any people who were enslaved at the time of Illinois statehood would continue on in their enslavement. And then another sort of loophole allowed for people from the South to bring enslaved people to Illinois and register them with work contracts that were supposed to be a year long, but were renewable indefinitely. Or also people traveling with enslaved servants could register them as indentured servitude. And indentured servitude is basically de facto slavery. An indentured servant's contract could be sold. They could be subject to physical abuse. The term of the indenture might last as long as 99 years. It was a condition that was hereditary, so an indentured mother's children would be born into an indentured condition that would last until age 18 for women or 21 for men. So some of the women that we can consider who came to Illinois as indentured servants, one is a woman named Rebecca Woods, and she was born enslaved in Maryland and brought to Illinois as a servant by Nicholas Ridgely. And she remained with the Ridgely family the rest of her life. She died in 1865. She's listed on the census as a free colored woman in 1850 and as a servant in 1860. But the extent of her freedom is unclear, whether she truly felt free, whether she felt any agency to leave the Ridgely family or not. One doesn't know. Her obituary indicates that she was a beloved figure in the household. She would call on her friends on Sunday, and people always looked forward to seeing with her. And again, as the same with Phoebe Roundtree, we don't actually have any objects connected directly to Rebecca Woods. What we have is her grave marker in Oak Ridge Cemetery. And Rebecca was buried in the Ridgely family plot. And on her tombstone, it says, for many years, a faithful servant. And so I think this gravestone sort of speaks volumes about the nature of indentured servitude. This is her memorial for all time. So regardless of who Rebecca's family was, who her people were, who her loved ones were, how she identified herself. She has had this identity of a faithful servant sort of imposed on her and carved in stone, and sort of been co-opted into the Ridgely family burial plot. Perhaps that's where she would have wanted to be, perhaps not, but one suspects that she didn't have a lot of agency in the matter. And so the ability of a wealthy white family to sort of write the story for eternity for this indentured woman, I think, is what this gravestone is talking about here. And I'm going to leave with wind up our talk with the story of a woman who I think is really an unsung hero in Sangamon County. And there's been research about Nance, and her story is certainly not unknown, but I think she deserves a monument, because this is a strong woman who really advocated for herself and exhibited a lot of agency as an indentured woman in Springfield. So Nance Leggins was born in 1811 in Kaskaskia. Her parents were indentured, so that meant that she was bound to serve as an indentured servant herself. She was brought to Springfield in 1822 by the man who held her indenture. His name was Thomas Cox. Her father had died in 1817, and 3 years before she moved to Springfield, Cox had sold her mother to Kentucky. So Nance had her sister Dice was kind of her only family in the world. Cox is someone who he ran a distillery, and he was known to be intemperate. He dipped too hard into his own supply. So he was a man who could not handle liquor, and he could not handle money. So he actually twice mortgaged Nance and Dice, or pledged them as collateral on a loan. And by 1827, he is bankrupt, and his property, including Nance and Dice, need to be sold to pay his debts. And so Nance and Dice are sold at auction on the courthouse steps in Springfield. So in a free state, the capital of a free state in Illinois, there was a slave auction where these two young girls were sold in chains, as the recollections recall. Nance was sold for $151 to a man named Nathan Cromwell. And she didn't want to go. She didn't want to leave the household that she had been brought up in. She didn't want to leave her sister. And so she refused, and she was imprisoned in a salt shed in the community for 6 days, and then delivered in chains to the person who held her indenture then, Nathan Cromwell. And so Nance, at age 13, took the extraordinary step of filing a writ of habeas corpus in the Sangamon County Circuit Court for her freedom. And the case is on file. The case file is named Nance, a Negro Girl versus Nathan Cromwell. And in it, Nance lays out the case and says that she didn't go to Nathan Cromwell voluntarily. And so the key to indentured servitude was that it was thought of as voluntary servitude in early Illinois. And the idea being that a person had to willingly agree to indenture. And of course, that's probably rarely the case, the coercion and threats and, women probably don't have any agency, and certainly Nance didn't. And so she went to court and she argued that, I didn't say I wanted to be indentured to this man. I never made any contract with him. And she argued in court that she's now detained and restrained of her personal liberty against her will and consent. And so that's the legal document that you're looking at there. And we see her mark on the bottom. it says Negro Nance her mark, and it's signed with an X. So this is a document that a 13-year-old enslaved girl actually took pen to paper and made her mark, advocating for her own freedom. The circuit court referred the case to the Supreme Court, which upheld the sale. So the circuit court essentially said, no, you must go live with Nathan Cromwell. In the 1830s, Cromwell decided to move to Texas. Nance was pregnant at that point, and she didn't want to go to Texas with this man who she never wanted to live with in the first place. And so Cromwell convinced a local merchant named David Bailey to sign a temporary contract so Nance could work in his store. And Bailey was an abolitionist. And so this actually, for Nance, this is a lot better situation than Cromwell because Bailey is not actually going to enforce her indenture. And Bailey signed a promissory note to be paid when Cromwell delivered proof of indenture. So he's saying, okay, I'll take on this contract, but first you have to show that Nance is actually indentured to you. And Cromwell said he would, but then died without providing that proof. And so from the time Cromwell left and subsequently died, Nance was living an independent life. She was married. She had 3 more children. She was living in Pekin. And then Cromwell's son showed up and pressed Bailey for the $400 and said, oh yeah, you never paid my dad that $400. And Bailey filed a lawsuit and said that you never provided proof that Nance was indeed indentured. And actually, Abraham Lincoln was hired to that case and represented Bailey. And this case was appealed to the Supreme Court. And the court this time sided with Nance, said that the onus was on Cromwell to provide proof of her indenture. And the ruling said that the presumption must be allowed in this case that the girl was free, and that it was incumbent on the plaintiff, Cromwell, to rebut that presumption by showing some legal claim to her services, which, partaking of the nature of property, he could sell and transfer. Not having provided that proof, the judge ruled that Nance was free, and the sale of a free person is illegal. Finally, Nance is free, and her free status means that her children are free as well. And she goes on to live out her life in Pekin and later lives in Peoria with a married daughter towards the end of her life. She has a son that serves in the Civil War, and he is part of the regiment that actually reached Galveston, Texas in 1865 and let the enslaved people there know that the Civil War was over, that emancipation had been signed. So Nance's son was on the front lines of Juneteenth. And so, again, this document is something that's preserved in public record. We don't have any objects connected to Nance herself, but a powerful document speaking about the agency of a young woman to fight for her freedom and a fight that she ultimately won. So I have been talking for a very long time now. I really appreciate your time and attention, and I can't see anybody's faces. I've been talking to my screen this whole time, so I hope it's been going okay on your end. I would be happy to take questions now, and if you prefer to email them to me, my email address is erika.holst@illinois.gov, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so I can start seeing faces, and again, I welcome any questions at this point.
Thank you, Erika, for your presentation. It's very fascinating to hear about a lot of women that normally don't make the pages of history, especially the women who are like Nance, because we don't really think about women like her here in Central Illinois, especially when we think of it as Lincoln's country, and a place where you wouldn't really imagine a type of slavery. And that's something that's not normally taught in schools as well. I don't believe that a lot of, at least Illinois children, are taught about indentured servitude and how much like slavery it was. So I'm going to kick us off with our first question. Mine is more like a public history question because you and I both study the same topics in history, which is class structures, women, and material culture. And one thing that I have found very interesting in my studies is that I'm always drawn to women who tend to not have any artifacts available. Sometimes there's like a document, or they're mentioned in a letter, or there's a newspaper clipping, or there's an oral history that's been passed down, but you can't really find too much information. But more and more lately, people have been drawn to not great man history. They're interested in the life of everyday individuals and how they were part of the big stories that are recorded. So how do you, for the people out there, how do you come to these individuals? How do you find them? And how important do you feel their story is today?
I feel they're incredibly important, and I think you're hitting on sort of frankly a bias in the preservation of history. The preservation of history is biased towards people who could write, the educated, people who left written testimony behind, people who society deemed were newsworthy, whose lives were accounted for in newspapers. And this leaves out a great swath of people. And so, like in my presentation, people like Nancy Dobbins or Nance or Rebecca Woods didn't leave their own testimony behind and didn't leave their own artifacts behind. So I think we as historians need to broaden our net, basically, and our thinking in terms of what constitutes historical evidence, and really lean on oral history more, and seek out people whose stories haven't been told, and ask their family histories, and really give some privilege to oral traditions, which stand in, and often historians like things written down. So if it's not written down, or you can't hold up a letter to prove something, it's sometimes not given as much weight. So I think rethinking the weight that we do give to oral tradition and direct testimony. And then I'm, as a material culture person, I'm always a fan of archaeology as well too, because archaeology is incredibly democratic. Things that wind up in museums tend to be elite objects saved by people who had the means to hang on to something and save it, who had connections to museums, or people who worked in museums and could bring them to curators' attentions. It's a very refined and self-selected group of objects, whereas archaeology is something that everyone produced trash, everyone had refuse, people threw it away and didn't anticipate anyone would ever look at it again. So it's a really sort of unfiltered look into people's lives when you can dig through their trash in archaeology.
Yeah, I think it was an exciting moment when you ended up finding, what was it, like a latrine in the backyard of the Edwards place, and you were able to find so much information about the family and what they threw away. It's just so neat to see that. I know that you've done a lot of work with the archaeological site at the Edwards place, but then also a little bit with the 1908 race riots. Do you know if there are going to be any stories of the Portuguese neighborhood that was there before it was the Black neighborhood in Springfield?
I don't know that. I know that the artifacts are still being processed and the final report written. I do know that the archaeologist has done a lot of research into the evolution of the neighborhood, and tracked sort of the occupation of the east side of town over 50 years, and he put together a great report on that. So yeah, the Portuguese immigrants is another sort of fascinating subset to the story of Springfield.
Yeah, the great migration of them fascinates me only a little bit right now. It's growing even bit larger because Julia DeCrasto, who was a laundress for the Lincolns, lived in that neighborhood. And she tells an oral history to a newspaper about the Portuguese in her neighborhood who need legal support because they're getting ready to be evicted from their homes. And so it's interesting to see how immigrant stories tend to grow even more within the Central Illinois area. And Portuguese is something that you would think would be in other states, but in Illinois, there's a large population of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have some questions here from some of our listeners, and our first one actually comes from Jean Richards. She is wanting to know, what was Phoebe Floorville's father's name?
His name was Henry Roundtree, and he, not sure if he was born in Kentucky, but they were certainly living in Kentucky before they came to Illinois.
And then our next question comes from Christine. Does the museum have any artifacts associated with the Women's College in Jacksonville from its founding in the early 19th century?
We do not. Hi, Christine. I wish we did. And the gaps in the collection are significant. And so there are, certain things like women's suffrage we don't have a lot about. We don't have anything from early Jacksonville. So I wish we did, and we're still trying to fill those gaps, but, sadly, no.
I believe there's a book out that was called Women in Education in Lincoln Country.
Oh, neat.
And it has letters from women who attended so the early women's college in Jacksonville.
That's cool.
Back when it was just a building, so like a house, sorry. And all the letters that are in that were transcribed by a volunteer at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. And you can find those letters within the collection. And I'm pretty sure it's on archive space because I know that they've been used for the book in regards to the graphics that were used. So that book was fascinating because you get to see women going to school and working at the same time. And it's something that I think a lot of women today can relate to. A lot of college students can, because you're working while you're going to school. So then you can pay for your education. Well, I had another question for you when I was listening. A lot of what you spoke about was very fascinating about how each person's social upbringing affected their life when they eventually came out here to Illinois. When you were going through the collections, which are very extensive at the museum, what is the most interesting artifact that you have found relating to women within your collections?
I was just talking to our staff the other day about what makes a powerful artifact. And I think a truly powerful artifact works on three different levels. First, it's something that you can plug into the kind of broader scope of history. So it's of its historical context, but it also speaks to a personal individual experience, and that the story resonates to such a degree that the viewer of the object is moved or is curious. And so we don't have as many powerful objects as we'd like, but we're getting more of them. Some of our recent acquisitions include a glove that was knitted and embroidered by a Norwegian immigrant who set sail from Norway to America in the company of her fiance who died at sea. And so she landed in New York utterly alone with an ocean between her and her family and unable to speak English. And so made her way to Chicago and worked as a domestic servant for many years, and sort of assimilated into American culture, and became kind of this Americanized woman, but who still, held on to the things that she brought with her and her traditions from her home country. So that one speaks to me a lot. There's a sad iron that we were given by a woman who came from Mississippi to Joliet in the early 1960s. She was part of the Great Migration, and she was a sharecropper's daughter. She can remember drinking at segregated water fountains. She said that her father would tell them to lay down on the floor of their house when a truck drove by because they were afraid that people would shoot into their house. But she also had fond memories of her mother and her grandmother wrapping a towel around the handle of the sad iron so they could iron her father's clothes for church, so he would look nice and, put his best foot forward. And so when she was invited to come live with her sister in Joliet and help care for her sister's kids and go to high school in Joliet, she brought that sad iron with her. It was something that she had no need for in Joliet. Her sister had, an electric iron, but it reminded her of family and of church and of all the good memories she had. So things like that are things that we're always looking to acquire. Those stories that really kind of speak to you.
I think that's very powerful, especially the stories that tie with them, because that really makes the artifact and the person come to life. As we end our program tonight, I usually like to ask our presenters something that we can build on in the future in regards to our exhibits and the stories that are told. And the big question is, here in Central Illinois, we are dominated by the story of Lincoln. We are also dominated by Chicago up in the northern part of Illinois. And then, of course, Southern Illinois dominates a lot of what's written today as well. But going forward, what advice do you have for individuals who are wanting to display women's history, are researching it, or want to? And what advice can you give them in regards to how to present women in the best way possible? And I don't mean that in like making them look very good, but as in, how can we tell the whole story? How can we make sure that these stories that are being lost, how we can revive them again and make them relevant and help us move forward to make lives better in the future?
So I would say that I think it's the tagline of the biography channel and magazine, every life has a story. So kind of approaching the study of history from the idea that, every person has their unique story and is part of a context, the reason that they are living in a certain place and having certain experiences can be tied to, a historical current of which they are a part, and they've made their own contributions. So I would say just to kind of keep ears and eyes open and think about who is telling stories and why, and who's traditionally told stories, and whose stories are missing. Like we talked about, if a woman wasn't able to read and write, she might not have left letters behind, or she might not have left evidence behind. But even, women who didn't leave letters exist. They have a footprint. They might have descendants. They might have, something as simple as a gravestone or a line in a census where, a story can be reconstructed and a life can be illuminated from that. So yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. You've added a lot to the history here in Central Illinois, and you're doing amazing work at the Illinois State Museum. I know I've personally enjoyed the Fashioning Illinois exhibit, and I look forward to your next adventure at the State Museum and what projects lie ahead. But I know tonight that these women and those of us watching this evening are truly appreciative of you telling these stories and making sure that they're being told and that everyone gets to hear them.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
All right, if you have any questions for Erika, feel free to reach her at the Illinois State Museum. They have wonderful collections, and Fashioning Illinois is still running today. It is going until, May 31st?
It's going to come down in stages, but the dresses will be up through the middle of July, so there's still time.
Oh, wonderful. So it's been extended. So feel free to go and see the amazing exhibit at the Illinois State Museum. Also, pay close attention to their Facebook page. I don't know about any of you out there, but they have been showcasing a lot of artifacts that you don't normally see on exhibit, and they're really interesting. They had a piece up today about a suffragette who came down to Urbana, Illinois, and there's a very rich history there with the University of Illinois system. So make sure to check out their social media pages, and also make sure that you visit our historic sites. They are opening up, and there are plenty of opportunities to learn about history here in Central Illinois, just in our own backyard. So thank you again for joining us this evening, and hope to see you on future programs.